Hello and good morning. Welcome to, of course, Mountain Standard Time, and I'm your host, Nathan Gita. Today I'll be speaking with Aaron Ekman, which is nothing new for most people who regularly view this show, except for the part that the now canceled former board chair of UNBC's Board of Governors is going to be talking to us exactly about what it's like to be canceled in real time, by your own side, nonetheless. Remember to like us on Facebook, follow us on YouTube, and take out a subscription online at the Western Standard, especially if you wish to continue supporting the only free voice in the West. Today, like I said, we'll be talking to Aaron, and he's our first canceled guest. We've had some other people who have had their brushes with the media and people who have kind of been ignored or fallen by the wayside, people who aren't the first people the media call anymore. But this is our first moment of having somebody on who right before our very eyes was canceled. And I think that's really important. This happened last Friday, May 28th, when the Minister of Advanced Education for British Columbia informed him and the world via Twitter that his presence as board chair at the University of Northern British Columbia was no longer necessary, so he was clearly an intolerant racist. We're going to let him explain that a little bit better. But I think it's a noteworthy moment because, first of all, Aaron's a close friend of mine, and he's been on our show several times, as we all know. But again, there's the reality that cancel culture itself, something that we talk about often, it really happened. It happened right here. It happened right here in Prince George. Maybe not the first place you'd think that cancel culture would happen, but this disease, this virus that is cancel culture is spreading. We live in such a disembodied world with a cacophony of stimuli all seeking our outrage that we often feel disoriented and overwhelmed. I've suffered the effects of terrorists and market crashes and even viruses. I mean, I lived through 2001, I've lived through 2008, now I've lived through 2020. But it's not like I ever met the virus or the terrorist or the bankers who were playing with our mortgages. But the closest I think I ever got to that actually was I remember being there at the Air Canada discount airline. Like, not I wasn't taking that airline that day, but the next kiosk over was where the discount airline was, and it folded that day. I watched people pack the desks, pack the kiosks, pack away the computers, people with uniforms on, not just, helpers and hands-on. Like, no, people who were from that airline who now no longer had a job, who were having to pack up the stuff that used to be a part of that airline. So that's kind of the only time I've ever seen it happen live. Today in real time, you, my dear audience, and I are going to speak with someone who was taken out for purely ideological and selfish reasons just moments ago. And that's historic. That's historic for the show. We're not necessarily breaking the story. Aaron did speak with some local guys here, but he's leaving the big guys away. He's letting us talk to him first. So he's not talking to the big news guys first. He's talking to us first. Another point to bring up here is that clearly even Northern BC is changing. Obviously, that was a voluntary position, and it was beholden to a woke left-wing government in Victoria. But without delving into that, we need to understand that the capital of Victoria would never have thought it could have told the northern capital, Prince George, what to do with its university board chair even 10 years ago. Nowadays, there's people up here who are even lauding this, thinking that somehow there really was a strike for being tolerant and diversity and all the rest of it. The northern capital has demographics similar enough to Vancouver and Victoria, I suppose, that there really are some echelons that applauded this. And that's not good, because that lack of solidarity will ensure we're mistreated. I promise you that. If we don't stick together up here, we're not going to get Victoria to listen to us. We'll get Aaron on right away, but I'd like to point out once again that we are living in an empire of lies, which is what John Paul II used to call the Soviet Union. The government gained nothing by canceling my dear friend, save to prove for the nth time its supremacy and ability to redefine the very fabric of reality. Orwell warned us about this, a political machine that sought total control. We've arrived at that point that he said the spirit of man was going to be stomped in the face by a jackboot, by the state, over and over again for eternity. The spirit of man. Hopefully, we're able to struggle back up on top to our feet before it's too late. We'll bring Aaron on right away and chat with him for a short while. Sure, Aaron's going to run the show today. It's really what's going to happen. Welcome to the program, Aaron. You're the cancer fan.
I suppose so. Yeah, it's wonderful to join the club. I guess it appears to be good company. It kind of feels like as you know, I'm a bit of an atheist, but it sort of feels like how I imagined going to hell would always be. It's where all the interesting people end up. But I wanted to start by congratulating you on moving the studio. I see that the glorious picture behind you, the view from the Northern Legislature, hasn't changed much since you've moved from the East Wing to the West Wing. So that's good.
Right.
I was worried you'd lose the view in the move.
No. We can still see a few things from here. It's nice. The citadel that we're going to build now that you are a pariah to the BC NDP. So let's walk through this. So you weren't seeking another term. You were. Let's go right back to the beginning. How did you become board chair to begin with?
Well, that's a good place to start because a lot of folks probably don't. They're probably not familiar with sort of the standard university governance structure. So in BC anyway, it's a bicameral system at universities, and for the most, not so much at colleges because they don't have a senate, but universities have a board and they have a senate. The senate, for the most part, is made up of faculty. It's quite large. And they have jurisdiction over, curriculum changes, a lot of policy, etc. And it's presided over by the president of the university, who is hired by the board. The board is smaller in terms of membership, but it's made up of a mixture of government appointees. We're not elected; we're appointed by government. So every time you get a changeover in government, you usually start to see a changeover in the university boards. And to be clear, in terms of public institutions across the province, there's over 300 different public boards and agencies that when a new government comes in, they start, as the terms start to expire for each of those public officials, those appointees, they reappoint them. If you go way back to 2001, 2002, when the BC Liberals were first elected in BC, they wiped out every appointed member on every board and college in the province all in one. Like everybody just got a pink slip and then just reappointed everybody. And so that was one method they used. The NDP used a different method. They chose not to wipe everybody out in one day. They just chose to wait until the terms expired and then they'd reappoint. So I ended up being the first appointment at UMBC after the NDP government was elected in British Columbia. And so I was on the board for a couple of years as just a member of the board. They call it a board of governor. And then the previous chair had she resigned quite abruptly. I think there was some emergency in her family, and the next day I ended up elected by the other board members as the chair. That wasn't that long ago. It was less than a year ago. I think it was like July 2020 or something. So that's basically how the boards operate. There's also some elected people on the boards. There's 2 elected students, one from the Graduate Student Society and one from the Undergraduate Student Society. There's a couple of faculty reps they're elected from the faculty as well. Only the faculty votes for them. And then there's some staff and support staff representative as well. So that's sort of how it's structured. Now, the position is volunteer. All the board positions are volunteer. The chair position is volunteer. So I've never received a penny from the British Columbia government or from the university. And I should also say that the decision to turf me on Friday, I think caught the university by surprise as much as it did me. There was to my knowledge anyway. I mean, I haven't really received any specific information, but it was simply an announcement on Twitter from the minister directly. Minister Ann Kang, who's a Minister of Advanced Education and Skills Training. At 5:01 p.m., she posted a tweet that said something to the. I think we actually have it. Actually, we can probably post it. But it just said, we won't tolerate racist and discriminatory comments, etc. And effectively, I'm dismissing Aaron Ekman from his position. So that happened at yeah.
It's coming up just in a moment here. Just
okay.
Looking for the spot. But
so
it'll be up in just a moment here. Go ahead though, Aaron.
So this is the tweet. So we have high standards for public appointees, and racist and discriminatory comments from public appointees appointments to post-secondary institutions will not be tolerated. I'm removing Aaron Ekman from his position. She made other tweets. I think it was like a string of 3 tweets, but this is the one that had like the most information. The other tweets were just sort of generic statements about commitments to diversity, inclusion, etc. So it's my understanding that that was the first that anybody had heard about it. So then the university didn't play. Nobody at the university, to my knowledge, played any role in making the decision. They found out about it sort of the same way I did. Now the question has been, well, what did he say, right?
Yeah, that's been. Yeah. It's that's been the question from the beginning. Is that what exactly are you being canceled for? At some point somebody commented. There you go. Brother-in-law works at UNBC. Says it's getting brutal up there. Mark Cooper's been a good commenter before. He sent me some good stuff that I need to look at and get onto. But that's exactly it. It's getting. I guess the problem is that we're trying to figure out what you said that spurred this moment for Ann Kang.
Yeah, well, just before I get there, I mean, I'm very sorry, Mark, to hear that. Actually, I'm very proud of UNBC. I'm very proud of the faculty and the senior executive. It's been a difficult time, no doubt about it. There's been two protracted labor disputes with the faculty since they formalized their status as a union a number of years ago, and so there's been a couple of strikes actually. And when I came in sort of in the middle of the labor dispute, and we worked through COVID to very quietly try to bring the parties back to the table and negotiate a collective agreement. And while I was there, we were able to achieve the first negotiated collective agreement since the faculty had unionized. And in fact, the last two agreements have been imposed upon them by government. So we were able to avoid that. So I'm quite proud of that. And the students are just amazing. Like I would argue, this might be controversial as well, and this is why it's difficult for me to understand, precisely what it is that I've said. Is I say so many controversial things in a day that I'm not sure which one they've sort of picked. But for people that are kind of concerned about what's happening at universities, I would argue that UNBC is one of the last sane universities in the country, and it's got a very immense commitment to producing research, especially scientific research, environmental research related to forestry, etc. That's vital for northern British Columbians in particular. And the students come from all over, but the university was created primarily from the sweat and labor of people here locally who demanded to have a university in the north that serviced northern folks. Because the problem families have had for so long is that if their children wanted a post-secondary education, especially if they wanted to pursue a postgrad degree, they'd have to go down to the Lower Mainland or leave the North. So the UNBC, I get nothing bad to say about UNBC. I'm immensely proud of that institution. There's people there, I'm sure, that are after this incident will be quite critical of me, but it doesn't change my opinion at all of that university. So Mark, I'm sorry to hear that it's not going well for your brother-in-law. We had been making efforts to try to make things better, and the board that remains there, they're good people. They're from the community. And they care about the university. So yeah, because of all those factors, I had, as you referenced, announced my intention to step down 3 months ago. And in fact, the upcoming meeting in a couple of weeks in June was when the board was scheduled to re-elect a new chair, because they've known for 3 months that I'm stepping away. And I'm quite confident that the next chair will be outstanding. But it looks like, this government, I have been, I admit I've been very vocal of the BC NDP government for the better part of a year. That's no secret to anybody who spends any time following the things I say day to day. And it just seems like, the one thing that surprises me is that, they didn't come up with a reason maybe to turf me earlier. It's at first I was a bit surprised that they ultimately tried to tag me as a racist on my way out the door. But when I thought about it, I thought, it's not really that surprising. It's sort of a pattern that's developing. I know, one of your previous guests, Aaron Gunn, who is widely rumored to be pondering a run for the leadership of the BC Liberal Party. He was just called straight out on Twitter by a cabinet minister, no less. I think the tweet was, "You're a freaking racist," right? And it is sort of this growing pattern of progressives in particular. And especially in the BC NDP, whenever they're confronted with somebody who either disagrees with them or questions their narrative on anything, they sort of jump, rather than deal with the challenge and explain their position or establish their position. They throw out the moniker of racist and hope that it diminishes that person's credibility in the eyes of anybody who might be watching or listening, and distracts from the real questions that they're asking. So that's sort of where we're at. Let me get to my speculation on what it was that I said. I think there's two different items, and there were definitely two different groups, I think, that were, advocating for the dismissal. So the first one, if you go back to May 5th, I posted a tweet that referenced a piece of government documentation that was going around about COVID on Twitter. And so this will be the. I think we've actually got the picture of one of the tweets. It's probably pregnant people #1 or something.
Yeah,
let's just put that up.
Share button here.
Yeah,
that's my camera. There we go. And we're just bringing it up here. It's always fun to see what the government's spending money on.
Well, this I'd actually planned to talk about on your show, but we just didn't find time. So I had planned to talk about this a month ago, back when I said it. But I just know this just came across Twitter, and I saw it, and it sort of caught me a bit by surprise. And this is what I should qualify. And this, I know that many of the viewers will probably be a bit incensed by something like this. I actually have no problem with it, right? So what this signifies, I think, to me, was that it's no longer kosher to say pregnant women in government communication. And so as you can see there, I just tweeted the link and the slogan and just said, I didn't get the memo. It looks like pregnant women has been deleted from the list of approved phrases. And the reason I said that is, look, I'm a union organizer. I've been a staff rep for unions. I've been a contract negotiator, both in the private and public sector. I've negotiated against government. On the union side, I've negotiated against private sector employers. I've also negotiated as an employer opposite unions. And so I have a fair understanding of HR trends over the years, and in particular HR style guides. And what style guides are, and they're called different things depending on the organization, but they're essentially it's a book that lists out, the kind of speech we're allowed to use in the workplace. And so increasingly, public sector workers in particular, but also in private sector corporations, all sorts of places, generally, across what I often refer to as professional managerial class. There are these style guides that are being imposed upon folks that place some compression on what they're able to say. And so there's another tweet that I followed up with that as well. I think it's the next one, that asks for somebody, if they are willing to, very quietly, to send me a copy of the updated style guide, which specifies that they're no longer allowed to say pregnant women anymore, that we now have to refer to pregnant people. And so that question sparked a bit of a Twitter mob who was rather incensed, because I think, I'm pretty certain that what they were, from the sort of the vitriol I was receiving, what they're alleging that I'm trying to imply here is that it's not possible for someone who's not a woman to have a baby or to become pregnant. And I suspect, knowing you and I have had a number of conversations, and I know where you stand on these issues, so you would probably agree with what I just said. I don't actually agree with what I just said. I'm you know me, I'm pretty liberal. I actually recognize that someone who decides as an adult to transition from a woman to a man can do so. I would still refer to them as I have no problem referring to them as a man, using male pronouns to describe them. And I also understand that that particular person might not opt to get surgery that removes their uterus, for instance, and could still have a baby and become pregnant and have a child, and I would still refer to them as a man. So this is the person that they're referring to. And I guess by me questioning that, asking for the style guide, for instance, the insinuation that was that people were saying that I was making was that birth dads, I think as they're referred to, don't exist. And there's one more tweet on this one as well that I made, because I took it a step further and I said, look, I'm really interested in talking to someone like this. I've never met them. I've never met such a person before. Someone who knows me, who's married to a self-identified male who's had 3 children, actually did tell me afterwards that Aaron, you did actually meet my husband, they said, at a convention. And I apologize for not remembering that person. It was our conventions at the BC Federation of Labor when I was there. There are 2,500 people. Depending on whether there's an election going on, so it's difficult to remember someone. So I did say, look, I'd love to interview somebody like that. I was going to talk to you about bringing them on the show, but we also do another show that I would have loved to have had them on, because I just think, I'd love to hear your perspective on a number of different issues. It's not somebody that I've spoke to before. But by posting this question, the implication was, as perceived by the people who were rather angry about it, was that, again, I was trying to prove that such people don't exist. And then they took issue with me asking to question them, because I think they presumed, of course, that I wanted to, challenge their existence and all these other things. Which, I mean, like, I can understand certainly with the climate that a number of these folks have to face, that they would draw those conclusions. But what's so funny is that every single person that was sort of attacking me, they all know me, right? They all know me quite well, and they know, for instance, when I was at the BC Federation of Labor, that I not only supported but pushed very hard to have the gender designations taken off the bathrooms. I know lots of your listeners are probably going, "Oh God, he's one of those people," but that's where I am politically. So it was interesting to me to see the reaction to this and how quickly people will sort of take a question like that, a desire to talk to somebody about these issues, as an attack on them. And absolutely, at that point, going back last month, there were a number of calls. There was no fewer than like 4 different lawyers from the Lower Mainland who were actively sending copies of my tweets to different groups at the university, and probably to the ministry as well, trying to get me fired. So I expected, around that point, that I'd probably, get dismissed or something, and try to be labeled as a transphobe. But it didn't. Nothing happened. So the month kind of carried on. So then the next tweet comes, and I don't know if you had any comment on where we're at so far before I carry on, but
no, I mean, this is of course what this forum is for. For those of us who, of course, the Albertan here giving us his 2 thoughts. He always gives us a couple of his cents. The narrative must be swallowed whole without question. I mean, and this is just it. They're not allowed to have any kind of nuanced opinion here. I mean, what you've expressed so far, as much as people might only hear the taking the labels off the bathrooms thing. And if this was Fox, that's where I would capitalize. But the point is that you're trying to have an actually nuanced opinion on this. You're trying to speak to people who are from a different walk of life, and you're trying to kind of understand those things. There's nothing wrong with that. Ultimately, obviously we fall on different sides of this question on a lot of counts, but this is what this forum is for. It's for people to get their opinions out there and talk without a filter. That's why we're here. That's all I've got to say about that. I'm just happy to have you roll along here and tell us a bit more about how you ended up getting canceled from a volunteer position. That's
well. This is what's so ironic about this sort of the whole political climate right now, is that the guy that supports transgender rights, the guy that thinks that we should take gender designations off of bathrooms, has a very difficult time getting any airtime on sort of left-wing publications. It's the right-wing conservative that has me on a show to talk about it, who actually disagrees with me on it. So I mean, that's just very interesting to me, and part of the reason why I like this show so much. Anyway, yeah, no, it's telling. It's actually quite fascinating. So anyway, let's jump forward to what happened on Friday, because despite all the efforts of what you might describe as left-wing trans activists trying to get me fired, it doesn't appear that they were successful. And so when we're talking about why I was canceled, so to speak, and I want to be clear, we talk a lot about cancel culture, etc. I'm not complaining about what's happened. I don't see myself as having been victimized to the same extent, I think, as many people would. I engage in controversial discussions all the time. And like I said, the one thing that surprised me the most was that they sort of fired me when they did, why they did, and as late in the game as they did. Because you
can't. You're fired. It's
sort of well, and I think I've been appearing on this show fairly frequently, and that probably didn't help very much. But I have no regrets whatsoever. In any case, so let's go to Friday. So let's start with the link to the joint statement that was put out by the Finance Minister, Selena Robinson, and Rachna Singh, who's the Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism. This was a statement that was put out. It's a web link to mark Jewish Heritage Month. And just scroll down to the 5th paragraph, and let's look at the first sentence. There it is right there, right at the bottom of the screen. It says, over the last few years, there has been an increase in anti-Semitism and bigotry in BC. So that so I read these statements because, well, I have a Hebrew name, and even though I'm not Jewish, I can't necessarily trust some Nazi roaming around with a club to be able to tell the difference. And so I keep track of the stats of anti-Jewish violence and discrimination and bigotry quite closely. I track this stuff every year. And these stats actually do exist. It's not like this has to be anecdotal information. And the reason that statement stuck out to me is because it's not in keeping with the data that I was familiar with. So there's a fairly well-known Jewish organization, B'nai B'rith, that produces an annual audit every year of the number of incidents of anti-Jewish violence, bigotry, hatred, etc. In a big report. And there's another. I think I actually included the B'nai B'rith link. We can probably post that website as well, just to show people. I mean, you can go look at this data, and they compile it. I mean, these are good reports. I recommend you read them. And you can see that there's the 2020 report, the 2019, 2018, 2017. And they go through and there's photographs of all of the terrible things that get put up, the graffiti, the swastikas that get posted, incidents of violence, that kind of stuff. I recommend people read this because it will actually surprise you how much of this garbage takes place in Canada. And it's absolutely true that the rate of increase of these incidents in some areas, like Ontario, for instance, is spiking at an alarming rate. It's in the Maritimes, etc. It's not good, right? So I watch this stuff with great interest. But if you put up the cropped image of Western stats, which I was familiar with because like I said, I've been tracking this stuff. If you look there at British Columbia in particular, but even more interestingly, Alberta in comparison to the other provinces is so low, and I'm not celebrating necessarily the low numbers here. I mean, one incident is terrible of this kind of stuff. I mean, there shouldn't be any incident of it. So I'm not trying to pat anybody on the back here.
But I mean, Mackenzie King's phrase the other way, none is too many. So
exactly.
Obviously, there should be no incidents of anti-Semitism or racial hatred of any kind
against anyone. Yeah.
Anyone.
But especially right now, I mean, these are the kind of things we got to watch because things are so heightened over in Israel right now. With if you turn on the news, I mean, it's just outrageous. But Alberta in particular, I mean, the stats are so comparatively low. It looks like they've had to combine them with the Northern Territories and the Northwest Territories and the Yukon. But in both Alberta and British Columbia, there's been a marked decline since 2018. So 374 in 2018 in British Columbia, which was a huge increase over 2017, by the way. Like, it was a massive increase. That was a scary year. But 2019, it would drop down to 2012. 2020 dropped down to 194, and a similar trajectory with an even bigger decrease between this year, 2020 and 2019 in Alberta of 27.5% decrease and 8.5% in British Columbia. So, when I saw that statement saying that it was on the increase over the last few years in BC, it just didn't sit right. So I don't know if our producer can show that tweet where I basically clipped the statement from the Jewish Heritage Month statement and asked the question to the ministers: is this true? Do you have evidence for this? And we can probably show that tweet because this is the one that I think ultimately sparked the dismissal. There's been an increase in anti-Semitism and bigotry in BC, say two BC NDP ministers. Has there? Does the BC government have evidence of this? Honest question. And then I quoted the joint statement. So if you go on Twitter and you find this tweet, you'll see that it attracted a number of people who called me an anti-Semite for having asked this question. And it's not like I don't understand why people would draw that conclusion. I mean, if you've been on Twitter at all, if you've been following the news over the last couple of weeks, I mean, it's a war field, right? It's a battlefield right now between pro-Israel advocates and pro-Palestinian advocates, and they're just going to bat with each other. And it's like this heightened state of aggression right now. And so all of those folks, I think, that were sort of battle hardened over the last week in defending the actions of Israel, in terms of like bombing the AP offices and all the things that they're doing, they're alleged to be doing to Palestinians, etc. They saw this as an attempt to downplay what they feel they're facing as discrimination, violent acts, bigotry, etc. in British Columbia. And of course, I mean, I have no interest in diminishing any of that stuff. I worry about it to a great extent. But look, until Friday, I was the chair of a university, and so data matters. And the data shows that this statement is just patently false. And I don't think it helps us to lie about that. I don't think it helps for government ministers to spread even more fear when it's not necessary. And I'm not saying that we should be celebrating that decrease, because again, we can't diminish the cases are still measured in the hundreds. It's not like, things are great, but we still have to, I think we need public leaders and politicians in particular who, instead of making emotional arguments that they think will sort of rile up different groups of people, they need to make data-based arguments that are based on fact. And I've always believed that, and I think that's one of the main reasons why we depend on universities so much, is to help sort of compile these statistics. So so that's basically what happened. I went back and forth with folks, for the better part of another couple hours, I think, who were accusing me of being an anti-Semite. Nico Slabinski, who actually, I like nothing bad to say about Nico at all. I've met him a number of times. I've met with him in his offices. But he reiterates this claim as well, that there's significant evidence of the increase, which, based on the data that I've just shown you, is not true. Now, I want to make a caveat here that, in Nico's defense, he may indeed have more recent data just for the first few months of 2021 that I haven't seen. And, my question to the ministers was, is there more data that you're basing this on? But their statement, of course, was over the past few years. So I'm willing to concede that, when the 2021 data is produced, that there will in fact be an increase. I mean, that's quite possible, especially considering what's going on right now. But nobody's produced this data yet. But there have been claims that, the data does exist. So anyway, that's sort of how that played out. And then by 5:01 p.m., the minister released that tweet announcing my dismissal. I don't know. Have we shown that one already?
Yeah. From Anne Chang, right? Yeah.
So, I mean, it's kind of an interesting case, because I think most people that sort of hear it, that are concerned about what's going on at universities, they probably get, they get angry at the university, et cetera, and make the case that, universities are getting too canceling and stuff. But in this case, it wasn't the university that made the decision. There wasn't a huge outcry from, student groups and faculty and the public to have me dismissed. It was, and in fact, like, these trans activists that I've been talking about, people that I know, people that I actually agree with on most questions, they've been trying for the better part of a month to get me turfed, to no avail. But this, what I was called an anti-Semite on Friday.
Be clear, they tried to get you turfed because you are a turf. That's their point.
Well, the funny thing is, I'm actually not a turf. My position's changed a little bit. I have some sympathy for what are termed the trans exclusionary radical feminists within the feminist milieu, but I'm a Marxist, so my sympathy for them, I sort of see the interplay between trans activists in the feminist milieu and so-called TERFs as the same effort within that grouping to try to expel the Marxists, because the so-called TERFs are really the last Marxists left in feminism. Very similar to what happened between social democrats and communists in the labor movement back in the 50s, when communists were all expelled from the labor movement. So that's sort of playing out. But I think you would actually probably agree with radical. I prefer to call them radical feminists, but I think you would agree with them on more points than I would, especially on their, they have what I would regard as a rather Puritan position on pornography. But they would definitely, I think you would like that, and they definitely agree with you on, the kind of things that you were talking to Chris Elston about yesterday. And I'll admit, I share concerns, despite how supportive I am of anybody's right to do whatever they want to their body once they're an adult and change their gender, etc. I do have serious and growing concerns about the kind of things that Chris Elston's talking about puberty blockers and hormones being used on and administered to children that are underage. I don't think that's a good idea. And I don't have any specific data to reference on that. That's why I don't talk about it very much. But I do see a growing number of people emerging who are, basically detransitioning as they get older, and they're starting to say things that are very critical of the doctors and the counselors that were around them when they were transitioning as an underage person. So I share those concerns as well. But ultimately, like if you decide tomorrow that you want to change your gender, and if you want to even pay for the surgery to do it, like, doesn't matter to me at all, right? I mean, I'll refer to you however you like, and that's always been my position on it, and that's kind of, it's a bit of a libertarian approach to it, I suppose, which is interesting for a socialist like me. But it is interesting that, like sort of the left folks that were, the other thing that makes the case unique is that, even though I was dismissed by an NDP minister, I suspect that the culminating incident was actually driven by more conservative right-wing forces. But even that's not clear, because there were progressive Jewish folks who were also sort of condemning the question that I had asked, etc. So it's not cut and dry. And it's a bit of a fascinating case, I think, trying to remove myself from it. So we'll see how it plays out. There's been I've got a lot of critics down in the Lower Mainland. Obviously, some people are coming out of the woodwork that have sort of disagreed with me on a number of things, and I know actually, like, there's pro-Palestinian people who disagree with me on other questions, who are celebrating my dismissal because of, so-called anti-Semitic remarks. And it's just interesting to see that, like, the kind of people that will kind of pile on, even though you technically got turf for something that they would agree with, right? But because they disagree with you on something else, they sort of join the fray. So it's interesting. But locally up here, there's been an enormous amount of support that I've received. I've had a hard time getting back to everybody that's reached out. I've heard from people that I haven't talked to in years, and especially a lot of folks that, a couple of folks have phoned me up and said, "Look, we disagree with you on almost everything, Ekman, but we know you're not a racist. I mean, this is BS." So that's been interesting to see as well, and quite heartwarming. But we'll see how it plays out. What the last thing I want is for anybody to cast any negative aspersions on the university. The university, the senior executive, the board, etc. They really didn't see it coming, and I think they were as surprised as anybody. I wasn't that surprised, of course, because, as you know so well, I tend to poke at the most controversial issues I can identify.
And I mean, that's why we love you. The thing is that when it comes to this in particular, it is kind of mind-boggling to me. Not only the course they chose, I think this is the thing that gets me about cancel culture in general. It's like, if you just left it alone for a couple of minutes, like, most people would forget what happened. Now, we shouldn't do that for things that are obvious trespasses. Harvey Weinstein and others that are doing terrible things, and we shouldn't just let them, like, fade into the background and not be punished. But in this instance here, we have a voluntary university board chair who has actually not made any inflammatory statements of, like, calling for violence or calling for hate. They're asking legitimate questions. He or she's asking legitimate questions. That's what we're going to capitalize on. We've got so many other issues here in British Columbia that could use the attention of the Minister of Advanced Education, like, trying to make things more affordable, trying to make sure there's access in the furthest reaches of the province. And this is what they're spending their time on. I just don't know why she would bother. And that's what I think cancel culture really gets to me on. It's a lot of energy exerted into places where you could have taken that same energy and done something productive with it.
Well, and what's so fascinating to me is, like, which pressure point sort of causes them to finally make the decision. So, like I said, back at the beginning of May, I fully expected to receive some similar announcement from the minister over alleged transphobic remarks over the question I'd asked about pregnant people and wanting to interview somebody who was not a woman who was either pregnant or has had children. But apparently that lobby didn't have the steam to make it happen, and whereas the pro-Israel lobby, who was accusing me of being an anti-Semite, I mean, I made that tweet at 11 a.m. ish, and the dismissal came out at 5 p.m. that day. So now I'm not, I don't know for sure whether that's the thing. I don't know for sure whether that's the one that sparked it, because she hasn't said. She's just said racist, discriminatory remarks. But if you've thrown the racist moniker in there, then it sort of excludes the so-called transphobic remarks. and so it leads me to believe that it was the allegations of anti-Semitism. So it just sort of it illuminates to some degree what it is that the government is most pressured by, or what they see as more of a threat. And I think possibly context, of course, is everything. And because things are so hot in Israel right now, between Israel and Palestine, it could be that the calls of anti-Semitism is what spooked the minister. I don't think she really put that much thought into it, to be perfectly honest. I mean, if you sort of understand how this stuff works, there's a whole number of layers of sort of mid and low level staff people who, and this is the one criticism I have of the BC NDP government, is because my uncle was Dan Ekman. He was the executive assistant for W.A.C. Bennett back when the Premier's office had 3 people in it: the Premier, the executive assistant, and one secretary. And the 3 of them basically carried on the work of the office. And once Dave Barrett came in, I mean, the first thing the NDP did was just balloon the size of the Premier's office. And I'm not even sure what the full budget is now, but the last budget that just came down in 2020, they gave them, the finance minister gave the Premier an additional $4 million on top of his existing budget every year. So it's an enormous office, right? All communications people probably don't really have a lot to do, and spend a lot of time, like on Twitter, keeping tabs on people like me who are increasingly critical of this government. So you say a few things over the course of a few months, those folks start to identify as as an undesirable. And what really most insidious about, people call it cancel culture, I call it identitarianism, and I think it manifests both in the left and the right equally. It's manifesting in the left right now in an alarming rate, but it absolutely exists on the right as well. But both sides are guilty of dehumanizing people that they've deemed to be disagreeable. And so once you sort of disagree with them, once you challenge their narrative, once you say something that violates one of these prohibited grounds that they view as lines you cannot cross. You cannot ask questions which they view to be of a transphobic nature. You cannot ask questions about the narrative we're pushing about violence and bigotry against a certain group of people. I had intended to post something, I think I just forgot, but during Asian Heritage Month, for instance, every politician you could find was posting a very solemn picture of themselves holding a sign that said "Stop Asian Hate," right? And it's so they do these performative things. They don't do anything to actually try to deal with it, because incidents of Asian hate have clearly been on the rise. I mean, we're seeing this stuff reported on the news. I got friends who have had incidents that have been quite alarming. That they were born in Canada and people are yelling things at them on the streets that they've just never encountered before. But I tend to be a bit critical of this performative thing that we do, where we just post these pictures of ourselves with signs, for instance. And my question on the Jewish question in BC in particular was, well, okay, if it's actually on the rise, which is alarming to me, then why aren't you doing the same thing you did last week about Jewish or about Asian hate? Why aren't you all posting with more performative signs at the very least, saying to stop Jewish hate? And they're not doing that. But once you ask these questions, once you ask them to establish what they've said, provide details and facts to support their assertions, they dehumanize you. And so for me, I think in this context over the last month, it's been an interesting little experiment to see, what is it that sort of finally prompts them to make the decision that they're going to slit your throat, so to speak.
And on that point, it's interesting because it is so much performance art. I mean, I remember for those of us who are watching in Alberta today, some of us might be recalling a certain Alison Redford, who was premier of that province for a short while, and she during the Alberta floods, the year of the flood, as it were, and everything else that was going wrong in Alberta during that year. She came in, and I remember somebody telling me this, that they'd been a staffer for her during that time, or they were just part of this group of people who got to witness this happen. Before the camera went on for her to do her little bit from wherever she was, she picked up a shovel, and she also went down and she put her hand in the dirt. She literally put it across her face like she was Braveheart, and then stood there and looked kind of dirtied and grizzled and I am Alberta, and so can you. Right, we are going to beat these floods, come hell or high water, like we're going to get this done, right? And I remember that. So
well, it's funny, that story reminds me of when Gordon Campbell was running, back before he first got elected. And I hesitate to tell you the story because I know you're a fan of plaid shirts, and I don't want to offend you. And I actually love your plaid shirt, but I find it a bit more genuine. But you go back to the late '90s when Gordon Campbell had first run unsuccessfully, and it became a bit of a meme even before internet memes existed. That in order to try to show that he wasn't sort of from the upper elite of British Columbian society, that he had more working class sensibilities, his comms team sort of wrapped him in this plaid shirt. But it was kind of like a Sears catalog or a Workwear World ad where they got these models and they're wearing these shirts, but they're really crisp. Like you can still see the folds from the packaging, and it's just not genuine, right? And so it was kind of funny. It was like, we know you're not, we know what you're trying to do, and you're not one of us, really.
You're not
but it is performative. It happens on all sides, but the left is really engaging on it, and in it right now. And I have been very critical of it, and in particular, I've been critical about the performance art around First Nations land issues, in particular, where the BC NDP government really sort of drums up their support for UNDRIP, etc., reconciliation, but at the same time, they're marching RCMP with sniper rifles into Wet'suwet'en territory, and the stuff that's going on down in Fairy Creek right now, which I think you've talked to Stuart about. It doesn't matter what your position is on old growth logging, and to be clear, I'm sort of torn on it. Like I think for the health of our forests, it's not even just a matter of like the aesthetic of big trees, and me having any particular sympathy for that. It's more about the health of our forests going forward and the economic sustainability of our forest industry. We've learned, like we already know that when you level a forest and then you just plant a monocrop of pine back in place, you don't get the same kind of wood back because that biodiversity is gone. The forest isn't as strong. The trees aren't as healthy. I mean, you have to have that diversity there, and that's what's left in what I think is like 3% of what remains of our original old growth across the province. But by the same token, if a reaction to what's happening at Fairy Creek right now, legislatively speaking, is to eliminate like all old growth logging, well, it creates a bit of a problem. And a good example, we were talking about on your past show last time I was on, I referenced this big fat log that people are all incensed about that they saw on that logging truck going down through Victoria. And somebody, I was kind of laughing because somebody was commenting that must be like 100 or maybe even 200 years old. And I was sort of laughing because I got 200-year-old trees in my backyard, some of which I cut down a couple of years ago. That tree was like 1,300 years old. But if our reaction in terms of protection, placing protections on old growth includes 200, 300-year-old trees, it's going to be very harmful for the industry up here. And so it is a bit more nuanced. But I think the thing that people should be most concerned about, what this government's doing up in Fairy Creek right now, whether you're a conservative, a green environmentalist, or an unrepentant socialist like me, we should all be opposed to this exclusion zone system that they set up, very similar to the so-called free speech zones that were set up during the Olympics to corral people who were opposed to what was happening into one area. I mean, that's an assault on our freedom of expression and freedom to assemble. And the idea that the RCMP, like a paramilitary federal force called the RCMP, can come in and decide in a fence where we can exercise our free speech, our right to protest, etc. Whether you agree with it or not, that should be concerning to everyone. And they're even doing it to the press. They're carrying out acts of violence against folks that are protesting out there, and you may even be cheering them on. But nobody should be in agreement with restricting the rights of the press to go in and document what's happening. I mean, that's how authoritarianism starts. And it doesn't really surprise me that this is happening under a BC NDP government. I don't think anybody should be surprised.
And why should we be surprised that under any kind of authority that thinks that more state control is always the answer, and you and I can debate that question all day when it comes to crown corporations, etc. But I mean, like as we were referencing last week, you yourself wouldn't call yourself a big state guy. I'm certainly not a big state guy. But this is exactly it. If you've got a group of people in there, and I mean, this goes back even to the minister firing. It's like, well, I mean, like, of course she's queen bee. Of course she just has the right at a whim to dismiss and recall and or appoint a new. Like, it doesn't. Of course she's in charge because she's the minister of advanced education. Of course,
it's the way the system works in BC. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I mean, yes, by law, but I mean, in a kind of cultural sense, it's like, well, you'd think you'd want some consultation between you and that person and maybe try and do some constructive discipline or whatever you need to do. But the point is that again, when you're dealing with a group of people who already think that the government is the answer to everything, or that the power of the government is the answer to everything, it's no wonder that they're willing to call up the Queen's Cowboys. That's what I always prefer to call the RCMP, and send them into anywhere, right? And to get their will done and to corral people and that sort of thing. It's just par for the course. I mean, it's the government doing it, and the government is always right. So,
well, maybe our producer can put up that link to that article, that was posted on the PG Daily News this last night, I think, by Peter Ewart, who's a well-known commentator in Prince George, because he gets into this very issue that you're raising, where he admits that I apologize for the photo. All these photos that are floating around about me are pre-COVID, and so my hair is, as you can tell, quite a bit longer than it was, so I don't look the same anymore. But down at we don't have to read it to people, but people should look at this article. It's quite well written, and down the bottom, Peter admits, of course, that the minister absolutely has the authority to dismiss a public appointee. And it raises interesting questions, and he's drawn, I think, the same conclusion you have, which is, it doesn't matter whether you have the legal authority to do this. You should probably talk to the person first before just sort of announcing their dismissal on to the world and on Twitter. And it was announced it was put in writing, alleging that I'd engaged in racist and discriminatory comments on the ministry website, on ministry letterhead, signed in the minister's name, etc. Which raises questions about defamation, etc. But and a number, I'll be perfectly candid. I mean, a number of folks have approached me, some lawyers, etc., because they're interested in that particular fact pattern. And I mean, I'll explore the options, but really, like, at the end of the day, let's say I hit government with a defamation suit and win a big whack of money. Well, it's not like the minister or any other politician is going to have to pay that. It's the taxpayer, and I just have no interest in saddling BC taxpayers with having to foot the bill for any other sort of nonsense that comes out of this government that they're already on the hook for.
Can you sue somebody personally who's a minister, or are they given protection?
Well, I think, like, if I was to explore, like, I'm not a lawyer, right? And I'm still receiving advice, but if I was to initiate a defamation claim, presumably it would be to the minister and the ministry. But look, I mean, you could, as the former board chair, if I had defamed a student, for instance, the student could probably do the same and name me in the suit. But public officials are generally bonded, right? Which means if they step into some kind of a defamation situation and it's successful, there's basically an insurance plan that pays for it. But the premiums will go up, and ultimately the taxpayer has to foot the bill for that stuff. So I'm not too keen to go down that road, even though there's probably I mean, some people have said it's quite a strong case, actually, and the reason it's strong is because it was it's put in writing, right? Mm-hmm. But the other interesting question is, and this is something, I mean, I'm like, I don't really feel like my free speech has been limited necessarily because of who I am and the fact that, like, I'm not going to stop talking about the things I talk about just because the minister decided to pull me in the last 5 minutes of the game. But the question has been raised that, others in the same position might feel that there's a real chilling effect on their speech if they're removed from such positions because they've engaged in that kind of speech. And so that's a whole different beast. That's essentially a charter challenge. And I'm a bit intrigued by that, actually. Not necessarily because I feel personally aggrieved, but the broader question, the fact pattern itself, is an interesting one in whether what's happened to me, for instance, if it did happen to anybody else, does it in fact infringe, like, does it violate our charter rights to free speech, the action that's taken place? So that might be there's no big payday at the end of that And of course, it could be quite expensive to go that route. But that's the interesting question. That's a fascinating one to me.
Your wonderful phone from another century is ringing. I can hear it from here.
Oh, is that mine? Well, eventually it'll peter out. It's in another room somewhere. I apologize.
No, it's not a problem at all. We have some legal advice from our resident town crier, Sheldon Clare. He likes that profile picture. We all like that profile picture, but he's telling us a lawsuit is likely necessary.
Yeah, I mean, what's this? The Albertan, the core tenet of conservatism
is a call to not blindly accept assumptions and question government exercise of power. So I've met a couple of non-conservatives who also hold those opinions. They're getting rarer and rarer, but they exist.
Well, look, I think in this current context, the Albertan's right. It is the right that tends to be the defender of free speech right now. Hasn't always been the case. I always, draw people's attention to the Everett massacre in Washington State a number of years ago. There's actually a wonderful movie that I'll find the link to it, but a documentary that's been done recently. But it was labor activists. It was union activists, over 100 years ago, who would gather on these free speech corners, prominent corners in both Vancouver, Everett, all over the West Coast, basically up and down U.S. and B.C., who would speak out against what they viewed to be terrible working conditions. They speak out against the government, etc. And it was usually in those days, it was the business associations, in particular in Everett, that would, fair, and I can't lie, with cooperation from like the Salvation Army, etc., they would try to drown out these protests. In some cases, they would be able to engage the police forces, or out here either the RCMP or the predecessor force, to come in and crack heads, as the Gastown riots, etc. But it was always the labor movement. It was always the left that spoke so vociferously in favor of free speech. And what I've been saying for years is that the left, and in particular the labor movement, has definitely lost any understanding of that history and allowed the right to be the only advocates for free speech, which is a real problem, I think, because I think working people, whether they're in a union or not, whether they're conservative or left-wing or whatever, they understand the importance of free speech, because they're always the people in society that have the least ability to be heard. They don't have a lot of money to get on a platform. I mean, this show is a great example, right? It's literally put on by a couple of working folks who don't have big subsidies from government. They don't have, a whole bunch of ad revenue from, Chevron and the big companies and stuff. And so it's more difficult to compete with, the state-funded organs like the CBC and the huge corporate media outlets. But there has to be a remembering of the important role that free speech plays on all sides of the political spectrum. And I absolutely agree with the Albertan in his comments that, it doesn't matter how much the left used to understand that, we've forgotten it. We've definitely forgotten it. And it's not just a problem for people who aren't on the left, it's a problem for the left. It's a huge problem for the left. It's a problem internally, because what happens is you see this kind of identitarian faction establish themselves into most positions of authority within the whole labor movement, and it totally changes the entire political direction. And there are major consequences as a result of that. And one of the biggest consequences is this total removal of the leadership from the actual working people that they claim to represent. And the question around gender-based language, etc., is a perfect example, in that, I sort of let's go back to this pregnant people question versus pregnant women. So you can absolutely write a style guide through your HR department, and you can get your union to sign off on it, that says that if you say pregnant woman, you're going to get disciplined. Or if you, and healthcare workers have been privately sending me messages telling me this, that, for a number of months, even a couple of years now, they're afraid that if they ask a woman who comes into their office who's pregnant, if they ask them what the sex of their baby is or the gender of their baby is, they might get disciplined, because the idea is that you can't determine that gender until the child is born and decides what their gender is. So when, I kind of like, so you can go through and you can so-called, teach workers how to speak, which is how these people view themselves. That's how they view their role, is to teach workers the correct way to speak. But I kind of liken it to my cat, who, you might hear at some point here because she likes to jump in on the live stream. I learned pretty early on, she's about 16 years old now, that I could teach her, I fooled myself into thinking I could teach her not to jump on the table in the kitchen. But, I got a baby camera to sort of watch her one time when I was leaving for a couple of days. And what I learned right away, as soon as I got that camera, was I didn't teach her not to jump on the table. All I could teach her was that as soon as I left the house, it was okay to jump on the table, right? That's all I was able to teach my cat. So these folks that are fashioning themselves and they're participating in this whole industry that's developed, both in HR and in the labor movement, to so-called teach workers how to speak, all they're really doing is teaching workers what they can't say when they're at work because they'll get disciplined, and what they can't say when they're around a union official or a union representative because they're afraid the union will chastise them or embarrass them in front of people. But if you talk to working people outside of either of those two environments, they speak a very different language. And so if you're challenged within the labor movement, for instance, in trying to purport to represent working people, is that you're already kind of removed from the interests of working folks. Well, if you're also developing entirely different languages, you're removing yourself even further. And so it just creates a bigger separation between union leaders and the members and the workers that they purport to represent. And the results, and it's not, I don't totally attribute it to this, but the results don't lie. The data doesn't lie. Density of union representation in British Columbia and Canada as a whole, but British Columbia is the highest decrease, which means that over the last 20, 25 years or so, the number of union members vis-a-vis the working population as a whole, percentage of union members is decreasing. The number of union members might be increasing, but it's not keeping pace with the population. And there's the divide between workers and their union leaders is not new, but it's getting worse. And it doesn't help to develop these different languages, to try to repress their speech, to compel them to say certain things legally and whack them over the head when they say the wrong thing. That's not strengthening the movement. And you're not really like I said, you're not teaching anybody how to speak any more than I taught my cat not to jump on the table when I'm around.
Yeah. And I mean, the other side of the issue is that I think that what kind of went wrong, because the left was the one not just protecting free speech, but they're also, of course, trying to expand it. We look through what happened in the 70s and the 80s, look at the fights, we look at the congressional committees and the discussions that were had around censorship. We look at the ACLU, we look at, the People versus Larry Flint. Like, these are all historical points that are being made, and same in Canada. There are lots of historical moments, and of course there's a certain civil libertarian, left-wing libertarian sort of viewpoint out of Trudeau Sr., right? Like, I mean, I think he would actually be scandalized by a lot of the identitarian moves of his son, because he was clearly a left-wing libertarian when it came to questions of, for example, homosexuality, right, and lots of other issues. So that's not new. Like, that the left was into that world. That happened. But I think where it went wrong, and people can accuse me of this all day, but I really do believe it went sideways with the safety regime. I think physical safety eventually bled into psychosocial and somewhat, I guess, spiritual, especially if the ideology is held that closely, a certain kind of religiosity and puritanism around safety of the whole person, down to their very core elements. I'm not saying I want people to be intolerant or unsafe with others, but a seatbelt, is one thing, and censorship is another. And I really believe that's how it came down. I think it starts with the modifications of our society in a physical way, and slowly but surely, especially with the smoking thing. Again, anybody watching this who is against the masks, I hate the masks too, but I think you lost your right to your own air when smoking went out the window. And the idea that the government could regulate the very air you breathe. The same thing with the classroom. Somehow all children would have to be put under the purview or the ordinance of not having peanut butter in the classroom. For one allergy, it changed everybody else's dietary habits. And now we have ample evidence that resistances or sensitivities around nuts, honey, and other issues, and even odors, is very much, it's not psychosomatic, but there are things that can be built up to help build that person's resistance so they don't go into anaphylactic shock. So we've made choices, and because we've made these choices, and I think these, because they came from quote unquote left-wing areas, the state, education, and healthcare, where people who are far more about collaboration and the eminence of the power of the institution that they're in, that kind of psychology that dominates that world slowly but surely bled into the rest of society, to the point where we are in this pandemic, and it's what's ruling the day. The technocracy is in charge. Bonnie Henry is our queen. We don't have an elected government anymore. What she says goes. And every now and again, a elected member of the Legislative Assembly who's appointed to cabinet dismisses a voluntary board chair for asking questions up in northern BC, and then carries on about her Friday, and goes and gets herself a bottle of wine that she ordered on Skip the Dishes. Like, it's just like, this is where we are. I really believe that this has been a progressive thing, and the right is the only ones left, I think, holding the bag, just because in a way they're driving the speed limit. What's a conservative? It's just a liberal who drives the speed limit. They're just 20 years behind, and they're like, well, 20 years ago you wouldn't have gotten fired for that, so I don't agree with it. But is there a deep principled position behind it? For some of them there are, but for a lot of it, it's we're just not as far along as you guys are on this question, and we're kind of freaking out.
Well, I have an interesting response to me anyway, but before I say that, I should just clarify. I wouldn't disparage the minister for getting herself a bottle of wine on a Friday evening. I can tell you, I certainly had a beer or two Friday night. And look, I've met her a number of times. She's actually very capable. I was quite happy to see her get that post. And again, I mean, she may have put a lot of thought into the dismissal. I doubt she did. Like, I just sort of knowing how this stuff. I've managed countless campaigns for these people. I was a vice president of the BC NDP for 4 years, right? So I know all these folks quite well, and I just know how government works. And I suspect that the decision was made sort of before it got to her desk, and I think she just kind of signed off on it. That's my speculation. I don't know, and she hasn't said. And media has asked them to clarify the reasoning for it, and the ministry has said we're not going to say anything further. So there really would have to be a defamation case or a charter challenge on freedom of speech to sort of compel them to establish it, but we'll see whether it goes that far. The comment I wanted to make, just based on what you said, you might find Camille Paglia quite interesting. Camille Paglia, it's interesting. Like, she's been around for a long time. She was what I would regard as a radical feminist back in the 60s, is sort of where she got started, I think, as a student, who argued in those days against female-specific curfews and restrictions that were imposed on them in universities, because the idea was, it's dangerous out there, and if you're allowed out of your dorm room after 10 p.m., for instance, you're going to get raped, and it's your fault for being outside. And she talks about, sort of getting radicalized in feminism in those days, because their big argument was, we demand the right to put ourselves in harm's way, and it's not for you to decide whether I can leave my dorm room after a certain hour or not. And it's really interesting, because she's sort of become, like, she's written a number of books since then, very good books, I think. Which I've read a few of them. I recommend you give them a read as well. She's extremely socially liberal. In fact, I mean, I refer to her as a she. She identifies as transgender. I think she identifies as having no gender, but she said multiple times, like, you can call me she, you can call me, I just don't care. Like, what you call me doesn't change my own idea of myself, right? Like she's quite strong in that regard. And so she was sort of a darling of the left, I think, until she started criticizing other feminists. A lot of which was around sort of the performance art, and she also you would disagree with her on her position on pornography, for instance. So she takes great issue with the so-called TERFs, the more traditional radical feminists, in that she doesn't think that all pornography is crime and abuse, for instance. But it's interesting watching the right, because she's sort of become prominent within right-wing circles and conservative circles these days, because she's come out as such a critic on the kind of cancel culture that we're talking about right now. She's made a number of appearances and had long-form discussions with Jordan Peterson, etc. But she always made this argument very similar to the safety one you're making, that It's absolutely dangerous for women to go outside in certain areas. In fact, I've heard her say things like, "Look, if you're a woman and you're like if you're a younger woman in particular and you're out running at 5 a.m. in the morning, there's nobody else around, and you're wearing skimpy clothes." It's a biological reality that if there's a guy on the street and he's a predator, and there are predators out there, him seeing your body jiggle as it walks down the road is going to trigger some kind of a primal urge in his psyche to chase you. And nobody should condone that. And if he 99.9% of men will not engage in that urge, but a predator might. And so, her response to that it's not like you shouldn't go running, but you should also realize that you're walking into a dangerous environment. She'd probably say something to the effect of, like, at least carry a gun, to defend yourself. But she doesn't deny that, like many feminists do, that, like, they don't sort of live in this world that they think should exist. She lives in a world that does exist, but at the same time, she demands the right for women to be able to put themselves in danger. And as a transgender person, it's just interesting to see how critical she's been of where many trans activists have gone in terms of trying to compel people's speech and the danger that not just compel, but also restrict what they can say. It's this combination of restricting things you can say. To many degrees, it was nothing new. There are many things that, you can't say without some kind of a legal consequence, but it's this new development of compelling people's speech. Like, we have to say certain things. And the first example I encountered on this was actually in the labor movement. I remember, as Secretary Treasurer of the BC Federation of Labor, I was charged with keeping our minutes of our senior leadership meetings. And I remember on one day in particular, we were at a meeting, and you always present those meeting minutes for approval. And going back hundreds of years in the labor movement, we've referred to each other as brother and sister. And when the new gender designation came in, as we started discussing these things a number of years ago, I had no problem with also adding things like, some people wanted to add cousins to it because they wanted to take the gender designation out to include everybody, in case there's anybody in the room who didn't identify with one of the two genders. And in my experience, I've been in meetings where more than one person has been present that didn't identify as either a man or a woman. So I have no problem adding, I'm a Marxist, so my addition was sisters, brothers, and comrades, because I thought comrade was a pretty good non-gender specific way to refer to people. But what sort of caught me off guard was somebody objected to the minutes I presented because I had referred to, in the minutes, I'd referred to a number of different individuals of whom I knew their specified gender as either brother and sister. In fact, I'd referred to myself as Brother Ekman, said this. And they took issue that any of that gendered language was at all struck to non-gender. And so I took issue with that, and I made the argument that, I have no problem referring to somebody who doesn't identify by a specific gender as comrade or cousin or whatever it is that they prefer, but I identify as a man. And I don't want to lose that tradition in the labor movement, that fraternal relationship of referring to each other as siblings, as brother and sister. And there's no, like, it's if you want to be more inclusive and more diverse, then you can add certain words. But when you start pulling out the words that I can use and you start restricting the ways in which I can refer to myself, well, that's different. That's a whole different thing. And what blew me away is because there's so much fear amongst everybody right now that if they step into these kind of things that I tend to step into on a daily basis, that they're going to get fired or they're going to get canceled or something like that. And so when the motion went to remove all of those words from the minutes, I looked around the room and like there's old tradesmen, there's all these little guys. They all had their eyes in their lap and they all put their hand up to vote in favor of removing all gendered words. And I thought, I'm in a cult. That's when I kind of realized this is different. This is a new instance of identitarianism that is starting to take over the left, and that was when I first started to think, well, I got to start thinking of doing different things.
It's a dark time. It's a dark time on both sides. Within the right, we're definitely having an experience of political correctness taking over, particularly when you think of how essentially we conservatives in Canada are stuck with a political class, a political leadership class that is constantly trying to find ways to appeal to, you know, the more progressive side of Canada instead of to try and keep the base satisfied. And that doesn't mean that there's no place to try and grow the tent. It is important to make sure that people who lean right wing but are homosexuals, people who lean right wing but are from minorities, people who lean right wing and are not a part of the old stock, or you know, identify with kind of the way that Canada's history might have been, who might even use words like colonialism pejoratively, etc. All that group of people needs to feel included in the big blue tent. And there's a way to do conservatism in a more quote unquote inclusive manner, if you want to get that technical. But what seems to happen inside of conservatism is that everybody, while we're the only party that supposedly opposes abortion, anyone who talks about it gets silenced, canceled, kicked out of caucus. While we're the only party that might have some discussion about, hey, how might we grow the domestic population and keep our population as domestic as possible? Not that we don't appreciate immigration, but only immigration is not a solution to Canada's demographic decline. That, again, that can get you silenced, that can get you called a racist by the other side, and then they carry out the task for you. Most recently, probably in kind of right of center political circles, is still the Laurie Thrones situation down in Abbotsford, where Laurie Thrones said this had the whiff of eugenics, handing out free birth control as far as any of us straightforward anti-contraception pro-life people are. Yes, that's exactly the kind of thing that we believe. We believe that is directly eugenics. There's no question that that's eugenics, and that's fine. So you're talking to your own base, and he was saying it to his own base for the most part. The NDP brought this up as a point of discussion. If Andrew Wilkinson had not bothered for another 15 minutes, another news item would have come up, and nobody would have remembered that Laurie Thrones said this. Nobody would have cared. But instead, he went and did the dirty work for his opposition, and you know, publicly executed Laurie Thrones in front of everybody. To what end, I'm not sure. He still lost the seat. So what? This is the thing on the right for us. Like, it feels like those of us who are pro-gun, pro-God, pro-family, that we don't get a standing as it is. You know, and for that matter, us farmers don't get much of a voice either. So even inside the right, it feels like that populist, grounded, familial, and fraternal understanding is slowly being beaten out of us as well. A technocratic class is taking over, and it's impersonal, and they might as well just use numbers for us instead of names, because we're subjects. We're not citizens in collusion together, collaborating together to make a better country.
Yeah, the Laurie Thrones case, I think, is very important, and you know, it's no surprise. Like I've gleefully disagreed with almost everything that Laurie has ever said for years and years and years, and I've had back and forth with him. I've watched him in the legislature. I've met him. I always found him to be rather interesting, though, because he'd make his position, I thought, fearlessly and also quite eloquently. But it was clear that he was he was sort of seen in the fringe circles, even within the BC Liberal milieu. They sort of let him speak on items when nobody else was around. He never really got anything in the question period. But you know, like, I also have a certain understanding of the different opinion demographics of the province, and I know that his riding happens to hold very similar positions by majority. And you know, Barry Neufeld out in, where's he, Chilliwack, he's a city councilor, or is he he's a school trustee? Yeah, another good example. And if you compare both of those cases, it leads to the bigger question of the role that political parties play in our political system, and whether they play a positive role or a negative one. And increasingly, I'm of the opinion that political parties greatly reduce the amount of democracy in our system. So take those two examples. So you got Laurie Thrones, who's, you know, he'd been around for a few terms, actually. He was very consistent. Like, it's not like what he said that day was any different than things he'd said for years and years and years. But in the middle of the election, the NDP was, as you say, able to make a big issue of it and generate enough opposition. And then there was anybody within the BC Liberal Party, it was a lot of staffers, I think, who had not liked Thrones for whatever issue over the years, decided this was the moment we were going to come out and actively, like, criticize him. And so they basically put the gun to Wilkinson, and he folded, which to me was, despite how much I disagree with Laurie Thrones, that to me really shouldn't be allowed. I like the American system much better, where neither the Democrats or the Republicans have the ability to drop a candidate. They have the ability to endorse a candidate. That's it, right? And so you've got this situation where you get a guy that actually does represent a lot of the views in his riding, because he keeps getting elected there, who now somebody from outside is riding, who didn't elect him, gets to pull him right out of the race. I mean, technically you could argue, okay, well, he's still able to run. But if he was in the legislature and they drop him from cabinet, I mean, like, it's a huge reduction in the level of representation that those constituents have, and they don't get to make that decision. The party gets to make that decision. Whereas a guy like Barry Neufeld, who's not in a party, they can't get rid of him, right? Because they threw everything they had at him. The BCTF, the BC Teachers Federation, for instance, threw a lot of shade his way. They had speakers showing up, chastising him at the meetings. And what happens? Well, an election comes around and he gets elected by a wider margin, and a couple people who agree with him get thrown on council as well by the electorate. And there's no party there to be able to take these people out. So even if I disagree with these people, we should be able to agree that the people who best represent the majority position of the electorate that they're serving should be able to serve in an elected capacity. And that means people like me have to concede that somebody like Barry Neufeld has a right to sit on that council, and people like Laurie Thrones have a right to sit in the legislature. Because what's the consequence if you start lopping their heads off? Well, the consequence is, first of all, those opinions don't go away just because you take those people out. All you do is confirm for their supporters that the big machine that they're up against is real. And it causes them to continue organizing along the positions that this person's been saying. And so, I said at the time when they tossed Laurie Thrones, this is going to be an igniter of a real divisive fissure within the BC Liberal Party. And you can see that some of the leadership candidates sense that. Even Kevin Falcon, one of his big campaign planks as he announced his desire to seek the leadership for a second time of the BC Liberals is that he wants to entirely remake the party. But he's also putting out a whole bunch of pro-diversity statements, pro-diversity inclusion statements, I think, to try to placate the wing of the party, the anti-Thrones wing of the party, for instance. And he has to do that. But basically what he's signaling is, we have to actually restructure this party to deal with the fissure that has emerged. And so it's, they're going to continue to have to deal with this. And the left, you don't hear the same kind of debate within the left. The reason I think why so many people on the left despise me right now is that there are so few people on the left who are saying, we have a problem with identitarianism. We have a problem with free speech on the left. And it's going to cause us bigger problems down the road. It's going to remove us further from the working class because we're not speaking their language anymore. And back to my situation at the university, the one criticism that I think that's launched at me from people who agree that maybe I shouldn't have been dismissed, maybe I haven't, it might be true that you didn't say anything racist, it might be true that you're not a transphobe, but, are you really conducting yourself in a way that exemplifies the professionalism that we'd expect from a public official? That's the question I get. My answer is, depending on how you define professionalism, I think the answer is no. But again, I'm not a professional. Nobody's ever accused me of exemplifying professionalism. I'm a union organizer. I've been fired from more jobs than I've even had because I've been fired from some jobs twice or three times. And so I'm sort of on familiar ground here. But do we, think about what you're asking for in terms of the governance of our universities? Do you want, what is a professional person to you? Is it somebody who's, a senior executive in a big corporation who wants to, further privatize universities, raise tuition through the roof so that working class kids, families from working class families don't have the same access to university education? Those aren't the kind of people I want governing an institution. And it also raises the question then, if a government can just sort of toss these appointees out at whim, but they can't do that to somebody like Barry Neufeld in the school board system because they're elected, it raises the question, well, is this a government appointed system for leadership boards at universities the right method? Should communities that the universities serve be electing their board officials? I tend to skew towards that direction. I'd be interested I'd actually be interested in hearing that thing debated out. Whether people think that government should be allowed to continue appointing directors to boards of universities, or whether communities should be able to elect those people.
I mean, I have a vote on that already, and obviously it needs to be voted in by the community. I mean, it's the one of the biggest things that went wrong with our public medical system, for example, is that we no longer have elected hospital boards. Because we have no elected hospital boards, we now have, and these are moneyed positions, if I recall correctly, right? Northern Health.
Yeah, those ones are. Yep.
They're sought after, and of course that means that you will do anything for that patronage appointment, which means you'll do anything the government tells you for that patronage appointment. Yes. Because they're well moneyed. The thing is that we need to get back to some system of electing officials into these capacities so that we can shape those institutions in a way that matters. I was a part of one of the last boards that made a real impact. It was walked back by the government at the time, but I was on the college board when, after the lack of consistency by said president, we voted as a board, and it was a narrow vote, but the board did vote to remove that president. And that session was done privately, but what happened was the BC government, the BC Liberals at the time, couldn't believe that a board had gone rogue. And so all of a sudden, the deputy minister was appointed to our board and was flown into Prince George for those meetings. God knows how much that was going to cost. Mm-hmm. And she was great. The deputy minister, very competent woman, very intelligent woman, great lady. But the point is that she was essentially sent in to be the school marm and to walk the board back from where it had been with I think, full justification of a dismissal, and walk it back and ensure that didn't happen, because they didn't want the egg on the government's face, and on it went. They didn't want to pay severance. On and on it went, and eventually the decision was reversed. But that was a coalition between faculty and student representation. Mm-hmm. There was of course the staff representation as well, right? Not just faculty staff, but non-faculty staff, right? Like the representatives of the various constituencies of the board in a traditional model, not the real Carver model, which is really just what happens when neoliberalism takes over a university. But a traditional model of various constituencies collaborating together to make a decision on behalf of a post-secondary, or any institution for that matter, where there might have much conflict on the ground, but ultimately they have to try and run this thing together. They came together and they made a decision, a narrow majority, but they did make a decision. And of course, the government couldn't stand that. And we need to understand that too, from a wider perspective. For me, as a conservative, as someone right of center, and as someone who, on a bad day, understands why the 20th century went the way it did, and on a good day wishes that maybe anarchy was Catholic anarchy, non-violent Catholic anarchy was kind of the way we went. Some kind of ultramontane reality for this guy. Anyways, the point is that when I look at that, though, like that walking back at that decision, it's like just like the EU. The EU always forced Ireland to vote again and again and again on joining, right? Like it's always, the empire must be built, and that empire exists, and it doesn't matter where it is. It's somebody's little office, that's their empire. It's someone's province, that's their empire, and the empire always builds on and on and on. And so, I mean, you went against the empire, right? You had your say, and now the state came down upon you, right? And that's how it is. And so I don't know if a stateless society is necessarily the perfect answer to that then, but I do know that every time we have a organized society that's formalized, it does result in usually more tyranny than less, because they can organize themselves into greater apparatuses of tyranny. But I guess kind of bringing it all back around, I think that we are in a dangerous time right now, because people aren't allowed to speak their mind, and because they're not allowed to speak their mind, they are finding other ways to act out, and the discourse is getting narrower and narrower and narrower, which is making us stupider and stupider and stupider, to the point where we can't have a real conversation about anything, because whether it's residential schools or climate change, or whether or not, anti-Semitic violence is going up in this province, which seems like a pretty cut and dry answer. Either it is or it isn't. Mere asking of the question, and whom is asking it, just because you have a Hebrew name, and even for that matter, a last name that could easily be construed as Jewish, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's like you made the mistake of even thinking the question, let alone voicing it out loud. You are doomed. And that can't go on, because that a society that runs that way will not survive.
Well, I agree with you, and I mean the society can survive, but the danger is that it will morph into something terrifying. And we've in instances where we've seen this kind of identitarianism emerge on the right. I mean, that's literally what Nazi Germany was. It was a right identitarianism in its most terrifying form. And we saw the same thing in China during the Cultural Revolution, where it was the identity that became the scapegoat was largely academics, and of course it was a class. It was the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie, and so. And like there was public shaming rituals where they were cutting off people's hair. There was executions, all sorts of things. So it definitely manifests on both the left and the right. And I mean, the people historians and psychologists who have studied this stuff in great detail, the question they're always trying to get at is, at what point does a society reach that threshold where it gets out of control? Well, nobody can say, because it never happens the same way twice. It manifests in very new and different and increasingly sophisticated ways. And I think this current manifestation on sort of the left, or the liberal left, is the most sophisticated manifestation of it so far, because it's literally coming in the form of anti-racism, and it's so it's so Orwellian, because it's this ideology that we can all, it doesn't matter what our color is, the shade of our epidermis doesn't matter. We can all be reduced to this base identity. And once you know that identity, the color of somebody's skin, where they come from, or their religion, or their sexual orientation, or even their sexual expression, their identity, that's all you need to know about them. That's all they are, right? And that's why I'm so interested in interviewing on this show or our other show, somebody who is not a woman, but is either pregnant or has had some children, is because, from my perspective, that's hardly all they are, right? And it's just such a perfect experiment in how identitarians react to a question like that. They assume, because they actually reduce that person. I'm not reducing that person to their identity, but they assume that all I want to talk to that person about is their experience as a trans man who has had children. I'm actually far more interested in knowing what their position is on BC independence vis-a-vis Ottawa, right? Because the point that I think has to be made strongly is that we can never reduce people to this base identity. Every single human is far more complex than that. Every single human being has political aspirations. They've got all sorts of, there's all sorts of nuance to their positions. And I had to learn this lesson the hard way years ago, having conversations with some of my gay friends and gay people in my family, realizing that like they were conservatives, back 20 years ago. And it just blew my mind, because I was making the same identitarian mistake, that just assuming that just because they were gay and that they had to flee a small town in the 70s because of the violence that they were facing every day, and go down to the West End in Vancouver and hang around Davie Street, because that's where a community was able to form to try to pull together some modicum of safety for them and some community. I just assumed, well, if you'd gone through that experience, well, there's no way you could have any kind of racist views against anybody else, or be there's no way that you would be a fiscal conservative at the same time. And I learned the hard way that a good portion of the gay community is actually quite conservative, and a good portion of lesbians that I've met are quite fiscally conservative, etc. So I had to learn that lesson myself. Nobody else on the left seems to have really learned it, which is quite surprising to me. And you're right.
Guaranteed demographics, and I think that's what the Trump second attempt showed, when we saw the big swing in the black vote, the working class vote continuing to carry with him, and for that matter, Florida being carried by him, right? Like which he won it by a significant margin. for the time, a huge Cuban American population in Florida. There clearly there was a place to resonate between the right and right-wing ideas and right-wing populism and people who, quote unquote, shouldn't have been voting that way. I think Chelsea Handler, everybody's favorite prophetess from Netflix, said to her ex-boyfriend, who we all remember as 50 Cent, don't forget you're black. That's why you can't vote for Trump.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, and that's the reason prior to 2016, people like me and probably people like you were saying, not only is this guy going to take out Hillary Clinton, like not only is he going to defeat all of his challengers in the Republican Party, but he's going to go on to win the election. And it was absolutely clear that was coming down the pipe, except to anybody in the professional managerial class, both on the left or the right. Because again, the PMC, transcends the political spectrum in that regard. But they didn't. None of them saw it coming because they don't. From my perspective, they all have racist views, which is, and it's probably more accurate to describe them as identitarian views, because they reduce every single person, especially these different designations of race, etc., that they treat as like monolithic electorates. So you hear the Democrats talking about the black vote, the Latino vote, and the gay vote, and this kind of thing. And just the way they speak, it demonstrates, without a doubt, that they view these people as all the same because of the color of their skin or because of their religion. And it's the reason why they can't predict the nuance that ends up electing somebody like Donald Trump. But the rest of us can see it because we talk to people. And we don't just sit in our office and issue decrees. We go to the grocery store and we talk to our neighbors and we talk to people we work with. And we know that the average lexicon employed by working people is not what you hear when you go to a union meeting. It's not what you hear when you go to an HR meeting, and it's not even necessarily what you hear when you're at work. And so that divide is absolutely growing. And the question about when does it sort of cross the threshold into authoritarianism? Well, you never know. But what we do know is that when you get there, it's too late. It's absolutely too late. And so that's why you have to fight against it always, even in its smallest iterations. You have to expose this stuff for what it is, the malicious nature of it. And that's why I actually don't have any reservations about using words like racist to describe identitarians, because it is at its base level. It's a racist, discriminatory analysis, and it reduces people to far less than they really are.
The sum of their parts, which of course they are a greater than the sum of their parts. As we kind of close up here, Aaron, well, sorry, I interrupted you there.
No. Go ahead.
I guess kind of as we kind of dwell on this moment of well, we can call it cancellation, we can call it not cancellation, and kind of seeing it in real time. What do you think your next steps are here? Do you think that you're going to try and not even with regards to this, like you'll take your advice from your lawyers and decide on those things on your own, but what are you kind of thinking are the next ways you want to organize in your community and help your community and move forward with the community?
Well, I think I'll probably continue doing some of the things that have landed me on the outs with the NDP, which is to try to continually raise issues like you're doing as well that are important to British Columbians, but more specifically important to northern and interior British Columbians. And I mean, the uncomfortable part, I think, for a government like the BC NDP government is many of those issues represent tension between rural and urban ridings. The biggest issue that's coming up that I think is absolutely vital, which I think is probably, I've been very vocal on it, and I think it's one where the BC NDP is quite vulnerable, actually, because they've sort of orchestrated it in such a way, is the issue of the Electoral Boundaries Commission undoubtedly releasing a recommendation to government when they do that allows government to reduce the number of interior, especially northern seats in the legislature, and increase the number of seats down in the Lower Mainland. And I think for Northerners in British Columbia who are concerned about how little representation we already have in the legislature, it doesn't matter what your political persuasion is. This is the kind of issue we got to band together on and make sure Victoria knows that reducing our representation in this government is not on. Because you can't get to the point where you've reduced our level of representation to the point where it doesn't make any sense for us to be here. Because there is that palpable desire to re-examine the boundaries of the province. And if your goal is to try to keep things together, and I respect people who have that goal, despite my own proclivities, reducing our representation is not going to take you any further down that path. So I think those are the things we have to continue to talk about. I'm also very concerned about frankly the finances of the province. I don't place all the blame on the BC NDP. We've just come through we've just come through a difficult situation with COVID and everything that would make it almost impossible for any government to run a balanced budget. And the Moody's report just came down, which is flagging some concern over the finances of the province, but there's some hopeful points in there. It's not all doom and gloom yet, but it looks like we won't be able to balance a budget for the next 7 to 9 years, which is concerning, especially considering that so many of the communities up here in the north, we need help. All you have to do is drive around, out west or out east and through the north to see, if you have any understanding of what the communities used to be like in the 70s and 80s, et cetera. If you haven't been up there in a while, it's a stark difference. And the populations are down. We've said this before. So we have to keep highlighting these things. And we have to keep, I think, what you're doing, which is so great, is providing a platform for Northerners to be able to speak on these things that wouldn't otherwise be available to them. And in sort of a long-form context as well. So you can not just sort of get a soundbite out, but you can take these ideas and you can turn them over in your hand and you can debate them and find out that, despite our political differences, as Northerners, we've got an enormous amount of commonality. So that's what I'm excited to do. And that's what I had intended to do anyway, which is part of the reason why I'd announced my departure from the university. Because I don't want to take away, through any controversy that I generate, from the amazing things that the university produces on a daily basis. And so my intention was to sort of, back out quietly and then continue to engage in the kind of discussions that we are. But the BC NDP decided to try to tag me as a racist on the way out the door. So, but again, like I've said previously, the people up here, I've been up here for a while. People know me, and they know it's BS. And the support that I've received has been, I didn't predict it.
No, it's amazing how people do show up. And again, that's something that is distinctive about us in the north and beyond Hope, as it were, when compared to Vancouver, which is south of Hope. I think that people don't understand that Northern solidarity is a real thing. And yes, we have some elements of kind of the professional managerial class like it is down south, and they have some of the same sentiments. But for the most part, we're still lucky enough to have a group of people here who want to be in solidarity with one another and care about Northern British Columbia first and the future of Northern British Columbia and therefore Western Canada and therefore this nation. So, but thank you so much, of course, Aaron. Again, it's always great to have you on, and it's always great to have you explain in no uncertain terms your nuanced position on a variety of topics. But I just wanted to say thank you. I know it's been a harrowing couple of days. I wanted to say thank you as well when you were helping us move the studio in here. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And we'll figure out from here kind of some of the directions of what's going to happen here in Mountain Standard Time, as well as our own show that we have elsewhere that's been on hiatus for a little while now. And we're going to start exploring those issues a little more deeply, especially now that I guess you have both hands free from behind your back. You're not exactly worried about getting dismissed. That's already in the past.
It was the eventual plan anyway, but we got a bit of a bump in the timeline. So yeah, I heard from the minister on Friday. I've got a bit more time on my hands than I had previously. So.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Of course, and thank you for being on it.
You bet.
Yeah, it's been. I mean, it's an important point to bring up, right? Here we are. At the end of these things, living through real life cancel culture. That was Aaron Eckman, former chair of the UNBC Board of Governors, and we discussed a whole bunch of real things there as you listened. But I think that we just need to reemphasize for a moment that cancel culture really happens. It's real. It's real. And it can happen in your own little town. I mean, Prince George isn't the center of anywhere for a lot of people, and yet even here, the eyes of identitarianism and the wokeism and the supremacy of the state, especially from the provincial legislature, they had to dismiss him because why? Because he wasn't carrying the narrative, he wasn't swallowing the truth whole, as I believe the Albertan was pointing out earlier. We're going to be closing out here pretty quick, but I do owe our sponsor a endorsement here. It's funny, we're going to do this at the beginning of the show, but it just kind of went by the wayside. That's fine. So that's the Resistance Coffee Company. I I love coffee. I've actually reduced my coffee consumption quite a bit this year, but I do love coffee and I love good coffee. And so the Resistance Coffee Company makes good coffee. You can order it online, which is, I guess, kind of the universal thing. We are located here in BC. I'm 98% sure Resistance Coffee Company is based out of Alberta somewhere. But the point is that it's good coffee. And if you need it, you can always order it online and it'll be delivered to your door. And that's kind of how we're getting everything nowadays during the pandemic, which hopefully is ending soon. So we don't have to deal with this pandemic anymore. So again, Resistance Coffee Company, we're thankful to have them as a sponsor for the show, and do support your local Canadian coffee roasters. So we're going to kind of close out here on a couple of notes. There's a few things here. We had a bit of a time, and I feel like I actually owe you, the viewers, and for that matter, anybody who also likes to pursue my column and peruse my column, as it were, a bit of a at least a mea culpa. I don't know if I actually want to use the A word, an apology, because honestly, life just got busy. But I think you guys deserve an explanation. So the short version is that between basically in the last month, really since about the middle of May, I had some really good moments up until the middle of May. But it got a little busy on my end personally. I've, as I've mentioned before, I recently got engaged, and then the studio and I had to move out of the place that I was currently in, which is actually where the producer still lives. And we had to decamp from there in a matter of basically from the last show, which was Thursday, from Thursday morning last till this Tuesday morning. We were in a state of utter just get her done. We had to get out of that house. I had to unload every single thing I had in there. So all of my life that was in that house had to get out of there. Some of it had to go back to the family farm for storage. Some of it had to go to the new place. Some of it had to be put with friends to say, here, this is yours for the time being. And then the studio on top of that, which was really like moving 2 households, certainly 1.5 households worth of stuff. It was a lot. And so I just want to say that if it seems like I'd been a bit preoccupied and distracted lately, especially when it comes to the column, which is not necessarily the freshest thing that's happened lately, I'm hoping to get back on that horse very soon. We've got the internet at the place now. I can, log on and start blogging again. It's not blogging, it's writing an opinion column, but we use a web app that's like a blog, and you lay things out in text and that sort of thing. So I've never done that before, to tell you the truth. I'm not a designer. I'm not a web designer by anyone's stretch of the imagination, but I just wanted to just say unequivocally that if it seems like things were a little bit hairy on my end, that's why. It was a wonderful time. I mean, I'm glad to be engaged. I'm glad to be in my new place where me and my future bride are going to live one day, etc. But it's been a bit of a time. So I appreciate all of your patience. I appreciate your support through that time and staying with us on this show while we're in flux. And I think as a final point, I mean, my producer prefers to go unnamed, so we'll leave him so. I mean, if you trace through every episode, you'll find hints of it here, there, and everywhere. But the point is that my producer is my rock here. Without him, this show doesn't happen. So that was the other half of it, was making sure we'd be in a position where my producer would have a space to continue helping me produce this show. I can't run this show by myself. He also helps me locate guests. And of course, we have Aaron helping move stuff in here and being a contributor. And we have, of course, the National Firearms Association to thank for letting us use their space. So it's been a bit of a time. It's been a bit all over the place. So I'm just very thankful for everybody who's contributed along the way. I'm very thankful for the encouragement that I've received from my viewers. I'm going to throw up the email again, just in case anybody wants to send us an email around who they'd like to have on the show and who they'd suggest, and any kind of suggestions for the show. And we're gonna work through that as best we can. We're hoping, of course, tomorrow we're going to be getting into the residential school question a little bit deeper, because we're going to have Stuart Parker on. I'll double confirm with him, but I want to just give you guys the forewarning. Stuart Parker's opinion on the residential school system is, to put it politely, nuanced, very strongly left-wing on a lot of counts, but a deep amount of condemnation for how much left-wing governments as well have hurt Aboriginal populations throughout their entire history, and including today. So It's gonna be a hard day tomorrow. There's gonna be some opinions on here that are gonna make people really upset. You feel free to vent in the comments. Please try to keep it polite. Don't swear if you can. But we are gonna get into it, and it's gonna be a hard one because I mean, finding the gravesite of those children in Kamloops. I don't care what anybody's vote is on it in the end. Like it's just a tragic thing. Like it doesn't matter how much culpability you believe there's there. Nobody wants to find a gravesite full of children who have passed on. Nobody wants that, right? And that's hard. So we're going to be working through all of that, but we need to face this issue. This is the non-cancel station. This is the station where it doesn't matter where you were before or who canceled you. We're going to talk to you. So remember to suggest more people to bring onto the show. Thank you so much for watching and tuning in. We'll be on again tomorrow, 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.